Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched 1988's Willow. Willow is not a movie that was part of my childhood. Obviously, most of the movies in this, well, all the movies in this series thus far, and most of them in general going forward, will be movies I've never seen before. And so it should go without saying that I've never seen this, but there it is nonetheless. Willow is an odd film that I've heard talked about by a few people here and there, but mostly seems to be either forgotten or unknown outside of some pretty specific, basically fantasy fans. People who don't really care if it's good or bad, just want weird fantasy movies and media and all kinds of things, D&D and all those sorts of things, which makes it all the weirder that for all of the odd fantasy movies I've watched, I've never seen Willow. I did not entirely know the background of Willow until just a few minutes ago when I was just giving it a quick once over on Wikipedia. I did not realize this was written by by George Lucas and directed by Ron Howard. So we have returning names and famous names, and it's an odd duck, I gotta say. I really wasn't sure what I was getting into. I thought it was gonna go one way, and then it started to go another, and then it takes a big swerve. Not in a necessarily positive way, if I'm honest. Right off the bat, I was kind of impressed because the first solid chunk of the movie has almost exclusively people with dwarfism or other sorts of I don't want to say disabilities, but there are a variety of little people, which is a term that I know the community likes, but makes me feel awkward to say. And they are very surprisingly, even for 1988, painted with a broadly normal and non-joking brush compared to a lot of the uses of little people and people with dwarfism in cinematic history in general, not even just earlier than this. That is a group that has not been well served being in movies and tends to be the butt of a lot of jokes. And so having the first 20 minutes of this film have an entire community essentially in this world, an entire race of little people that are not played as a joke, that are played as like a full-fledged community, culture, so on and so forth. It's not perfect, but it's a damn sight better than the vast majority of portrayals that I've ever seen in film, even more recently. So credit where it's due there. That said, it turns out when George Lucas wrote this thing originally, he didn't write the screenplay for this. He wrote the story. Somebody else adapted the screenplay. When he wrote it originally, he titled it Munchkins. So, no credit to George Lucas. You received no points. May God have mercy on your soul. What the fuck is wrong with you, George? Anyway, what's odd is that it does sort of diverge from there, does not keep with a particularly strict narrative arc, so to speak, but it becomes progressively more obvious that this is not a particularly nuanced or deep story. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does make it rather apparent that this is very much made for kids. There are some nods here or there, the likes of which you would see in a lot of kids' movies that are, jokes or whatever that nobody but the kids won't get, but the adults will. But on the whole, the narrative arc, the complexity therein is very limited and quite apparently for kids. Likewise, it's edited and shot in such a way that, for the most part, it's pretty fast paced, trying to presumably keep kids engaged with the story they're in. But it's a bit of a mess, editing wise and shooting wise. Frankly, the 80s are a particularly weird time for children's films, because if you were watching 80s and even 90s movies, children's movies, it was really a gamble what you were going to get, whether you were going to get childhood trauma or like wacky hijinks or some combination of both. And on the whole, this film largely falls into the both category, where it wavers between some elements that are mostly played in ways that are child appropriate. I can't think of any particular thing except for perhaps some elements of the battle scenes, although they're, largely bloodless. That would be particularly traumatic for children compared to some other films I can certainly think of. But there is certainly a lot of there's more than a few scenes that basically could be cut from the film entirely, serve no purpose other than to be, slapstick comedy for kids, and that's about it. The course of I'm gonna get into nitpicking a children's film at this point, but you'll have to forgive me. A lot of the progression of the story basically comes down to, and then they fell into the room where they had to do the next thing. And that's sort of fine for a kid's film, but it's not particularly compelling. Especially, well, no, I'll come back to that. There are a number of films that this could be compared to, both structurally, narratively, character-wise, but also in terms of, value for time spent, right? So on the whole, the two things that I kept comparing this to are not even actively comparing, but the comparison was made for me by what was on the screen, are, of course, Lord of the Rings, and also The Wizard of Oz. A lot of it is kind of similar, kind of being generous. I don't think, not to delve into a complete deconstruction of George Lucas's filmography, but George is not a particularly nuanced or inventive writer. He's just not that great at a whole lot of things. A lot of his success comes out in the edits or in the acting or in the overall composition stuff. And obviously a lot of the later Star Wars films were not directed by him and all these other things. So, you can go up and down with what to actually credit or not credit him with. However, as an explorer of stories, he's sort of fascinating in his own right. Not because he does anything particularly groundbreaking, but he does seem to be sort of obsessed with deconstruction and reconstruction of tropes, and particularly the idea of the quote-unquote monomyth, which is not something I particularly it's a storytelling structure and theory that I don't think is particularly true, but in the context of Lucas is important because he believes in it. So his deconstruction and interrogation of the monomyth is important in this context, as well as his very obvious in everything he's ever done, basically cribs heavily from other media that he consumed. So I think it would be more than fair to say that quite a lot of this was influenced by both Lord of the Rings and The Wizard of Oz, for better or for worse. In some sense, it's interesting to watch, if only to make those comparisons. That said, on the whole, I don't know that this makes for a great film. Ron Howard directing, I think I don't even remember what else he's come up in the context of in the series, but I don't particularly love Ron Howard as a director. He's sort of a director. He's not incompetent, but doesn't do anything particularly impressive. He's sort of the ringer that especially these days, more often than not, is the ringer that gets pulled in at the last minute to salvage a film, and it usually doesn't turn out well, but at least it's a film. But this was him from the very start. So all that said, none of the cinematography or any of that is particularly impressive to me. A lot of the edits are kind of odd. Again, I think some of that is intentional for pacing for children. That said, this movie's over 2 hours long, so it's not short. But there's also this Lucasfilm attachment that is so bizarre, especially knowing that after the fact, because there is some truly horrendous CG and green screening going on in this film. It's really a mixed bag. Some of it's actually quite good, and some of it is very bad. A lot of the green screening in particular looks very sloppily done. The animatronics, and I don't even know if there are any animatronics. I think it's basically all green screened puppets. There's a bit of claymation / stop motion in bits, but that's also green screened in a fairly sloppy way that does not make it look very believable. But yeah, the green screening in general looks very bad. It's particularly galling since the very first instances of it are possibly some of the worst, where the green screened elements are really basically floating around on the screen. Like they did not, it's hard not to use modern terms for it, but they did not do the motion tracking very well at all. And the actual chroma keying around the elements themselves are done pretty poorly, and it does not look good. But again, for a kid's film, they're not going to notice, are they? So maybe I'm, picking at this too fiercely, but still, that's the thing, is when you compare it to other things that were contemporaneous, it doesn't hold up like some of the others do. The Princess Bride came out the year before, did not have Lucasfilm and ILM behind them, and yet sort of knew where to use their money, how to use it, puppets and animatronics, and spend the money where it's important and not where it isn't, and do the few things that you do extremely well. And The Princess Bride is a fantastic film. That should go without saying. If you haven't seen it, just go watch it, because it's unbelievably good. I could watch that once a year. And comparing the two, narratively, The Princess Bride is a far more compelling film. It's a better looking film, has better characters, versus this, which is just really like, I don't know, it's like shiny for the kids mostly. It doesn't make a lot of effort to be particularly deep, and I don't think that's even because it's a different target age group. This seems to me to be at a level, Willow seems to me to be at a level where it's about the same sort of target group, where, you know, you couldn't show it to really little kids because they'd probably either get bored to death by, you know, an hour in, or just be freaked out by some of the elements. Also wouldn't be able to follow it narratively, and there's not enough constantly engaging them to keep them on. So it's got to be a little older, you know, the like about 10 years old or that thereabouts. And just comparing those two things, I can't help but make that comparison, and it doesn't look favorable for Willow. That said, I'm not sorry for having seen it, as a, you know, yet another weird, high fantasy vision from someone's mind, of which I have seen a great many. It is pretty low on the list of ones I would rewatch, but it's not without, you know, entertainment value or merit. You know, the acting's pretty poor. The costumes are pretty slapdash. Some of the sets are pretty good, but it's kind of here or there. They do some nice matte paintings in a couple of places, and like I said, some of the sets are nice, but it's like, I don't know. It doesn't have any great compelling need to be watched. But I watched it anyway. And you know what? That's good enough. Anyway, I hope I captured most of my thoughts on it. Frankly, it's sort of so all over the place narratively that it's left me somewhat scatterbrained. So I may have missed a few things. Anyway, if you've watched Willow, either as a kid or later on or both, leave your thoughts. Let me know how I'm wrong and Willow is your favorite film and I'm a piece of shit. I've been the Social Solipsist, and on that bombshell, I will see you guys next time.